The moment she laughed, I knew the evening was going to be long. I was standing near the entrance of Thornfield Restaurant in downtown Ottawa, still in my work jacket, the old navy one with the small tear on the left pocket that I kept meaning to patch. My stepdaughter had told me the dinner was casual. I believed her. I should have known better. The private dining room was anything but casual. White tablecloths, tall candles, a sommelier walking around with a bottle that probably cost more than my first car. My stepdaughter's fiancé's family had reserved the entire back room. There were at least 14 people seated already when she walked me in, her hand barely touching my arm the way you'd guide a piece of furniture you weren't sure where to put. "Everyone," she said, her voice carrying that bright, performative warmth she saved for company. "This is my stepfather. He drove up from Carlton Place." A few polite smiles. A nod or two. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, with a small laugh that she shared with the table like an inside joke, "He's a handyman. Fixes things around the house. You know the type." The table chuckled softly. I smiled too. Not because it was funny. I smiled because I had been doing that my whole life, absorbing things quietly, the way old wood absorbs rain. You don't make a scene. You don't correct people in front of company. My mother taught me that. My father taught me that. 63 years of living in this country had reinforced it. I pulled out my chair and sat down. Her name is Renee. She was 22 when her mother, Claire, and I got married. Old enough that I never tried to be her father. I knew that wasn't my place. Her real father had left when she was 7, and the wound of that had shaped her in ways I only partially understood. I tried to be steady. I tried to be present. I fixed the furnace when it broke. I drove her to her university interviews when Claire had her back surgery. I sat in the waiting room for 4 hours when she had her wisdom teeth out because her mother had a client meeting she couldn't cancel. I was never her father, but I showed up like one. That apparently didn't count for much on this particular Tuesday evening in November. Her fiancé, whose name was Garrison, was a pleasant enough young man, 31, tall, with his mother's cheekbones and his father's handshake. I liked him the moment I met him, which was exactly 40 seconds before that introduction. He'd stood up when I entered, offered his hand, and looked me in the eye. Good sign. His parents were seated at the far end of the table, his father, a broad-shouldered man named Terence who imported medical equipment, and his mother. His mother's name I didn't catch at first. She was perhaps 65, silver-haired, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the quiet posture of someone who had attended many dinners like this, and found most of them mildly tedious. She was studying her menu when I sat down. She didn't look up. The evening moved the way these things move. Bread arrived. Wine was poured. Renee talked about the venue they'd chosen for the wedding, a property outside Almonte. "Very lovely," she said. "Very them." Garrison's younger sister asked how they'd met. There were toasts proposed and glasses raised. I ate my bread and listened, and tried to be the kind of quiet presence that doesn't disrupt anything. At some point, Garrison's father turned to me with the professional friendliness of a man who had learned to make conversation at functions like this. "So," he said, setting down his wine glass, "Renee tells us you're in the trades. What kind of work do you do?" "Maintenance, mostly," I said. "General repairs." Renee jumped in before I could continue. "He's very handy," she said, with the same bright smile. "Honestly, anything that breaks in the house, we call him first." She laughed lightly. "Cheaper than a plumber, right?" More laughter from the table. Gentle. Not cruel, but laughter all the same. Garrison's father nodded politely. "Nothing wrong with that. Honest work." "Absolutely," I said. That was all. I didn't elaborate. I had learned long ago that explaining yourself to people who have already decided what you are is rarely worth the energy. You let them have their picture of you. You stay quiet. You eat your bread. What I did not say was this: that I had started my first company at 26 with $4,000 borrowed from my uncle and a pickup truck I bought at auction. That by the time I was 40, that company had grown into one of the largest commercial building maintenance operations in eastern Ontario, servicing office towers, hospitals, university campuses, federal government buildings. That I had employed, at peak, over 300 people. That I had sold that company in 2019 for a figure that I will not state here because it isn't the point, but it was the kind of figure that made my accountant go very quiet for a long moment before he cleared his throat and asked me if I wanted a glass of water. I didn't say any of that. I sipped my water, and watched the candles flicker. After the sale, Claire and I had stayed in the same house we'd always lived in, a sensible two-story in Carlton Place, with a vegetable garden in the back, and a garage I used as a workshop. We drove the same cars. We went to the same church. I still fix things around the house because I like to, because there is something deeply satisfying about understanding how things work, and about being the kind of person who repairs rather than replaces. I had never been comfortable with display. My father built furniture in his basement for 40 years and never once mentioned it at a dinner party, and I considered that a reasonable way to live. Claire knew, of course. She had always known. But she also knew that I kept my business life separate from my home life with a deliberateness that was, I will admit, sometimes taken too far. She had never been interested in balance sheets or acquisition offers, or what was happening with the federal contracts. She was a high school English teacher. She cared about Chekhov and whether her students were reading and whether I had remembered to call her mother on her birthday. We had an understanding. She didn't ask about my business. I didn't critique her lesson plans. It worked. What did not work, apparently, was Renee's understanding of who I was. I had thought about addressing it over the years. There were moments, family dinners, conversations with her friends, where she would describe me in ways that were technically accurate but hollowed of context. My stepfather, he does repairs, always said with that slight flattening of tone, the way you describe something that is fine but unremarkable. I had let it go every time, because correcting it felt like bragging, and bragging, in my experience, is something you do when you're not sure enough of yourself to simply be. But sitting at that table in Thornfield Restaurant, listening to Renee explain to Garrison's family that I was essentially a useful tradesman she kept on retainer, I felt something shift in me. Not anger. I want to be precise about this. It wasn't anger. It was something quieter, closer to sadness. The recognition that a person can be present in someone's life for 20 years, can show up reliably, can give of themselves steadily and without fanfare, and still remain essentially invisible to that person. That is a particular kind of loneliness that I wouldn't wish on anyone. The dinner continued. Appetizers. A very good mushroom bisque. Garrison asked me what kind of maintenance work I'd done. He seemed genuinely curious, or at least genuinely polite, which is almost as good. I told him about some commercial HVAC work, spoke in general terms. Renee caught my eye once across the table with a look that said, "Please don't make this complicated." I didn't make it complicated. It was when the main course arrived that things changed. Garrison's mother, she had been introduced to me at some point during the appetizers as Sylvie, though the last name hadn't registered, looked up from her plate and studied me with a directness that I found startling. She had been quiet for most of the evening. Not unfriendly, just observant. The kind of person who watches a room before engaging with it. "I'm sorry," she said, and the table quieted slightly at her tone. There was something deliberate in it. "I've been trying to place you since you sat down." She tilted her head slightly. "Did you ever run a company called Rideau Summit Facilities?" The table went still. I set down my fork. "I did," I said. Sylvie exhaled, not dramatically, but with the particular quality of a person whose memory has just been confirmed. "I knew it," she said quietly. She looked at Garrison, then at her husband, and then back at me. "This man," she said, in a measured voice that filled the room, "rebuilt the facilities program at St. Catherine's General Hospital in Kingston. Completely rebuilt it. 2009, 2010. They were in crisis. Everything was falling apart. The HVAC, the electrical, the structural assessments. The board had tried 3 contractors before him." She paused. "My mother was a patient there for 7 months. Long-term neurological care. She passed there in 2011. Another pause. The conditions when he came in and the conditions when she passed, completely different. His team made that place function properly again." She looked at me steadily. "I found out afterward who had run the contract. I always remembered the name." The table was completely silent. Renee had stopped eating. I didn't know what to say, so I said what seemed true. "I'm glad the work made a difference." "It made a considerable difference," Sylvie said. "To a lot of families." Terence was looking at me with an expression that had rearranged itself substantially from where it had been 30 minutes earlier. Garrison was looking at his fiancée. Renee was looking at her plate. "Rideau Summit," Terence said slowly. "You sold that a few years back." 2019, I said. He nodded once. He was a businessman. He didn't need me to say anything further. The conversation resumed, slowly, the way a room refills with air after a window has been opened. Someone changed the subject. The sommelier came back. Garrison's sister said something about the wedding cake they'd chosen, and the table responded gratefully to the subject change. But things were different. At some point during dessert, Garrison leaned toward me and said, quietly, so that only I could hear, "Why didn't you say something?" I thought about it for a moment. "Because it wasn't relevant," I said. "The dinner was about you and Renee. It should stay that way." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded, and I think he understood something about me that he hadn't understood before. Renee did not speak to me directly for the rest of the dinner. She was not cold, she laughed at the right moments, engaged with Sylvie about the wedding plans, thanked the server by name when he brought the dessert menu. She was performing normalcy with the practiced ease of someone who has spent a long time performing normalcy. I recognized it because I had watched her do it since she was in her early 20s. We left together, her and Garrison walked out ahead of us, and I ended up beside Sylvie in the coat check line. "Thank you," I said to her, quietly. "For saying that." She waved her hand slightly, as if it were nothing. "It was simply true," she said. "I don't see any reason not to say what's true." I drove home alone. Claire was up when I got in. She'd been reading, which meant she'd been waiting up, which meant she'd been worrying, which was its own form of love. I sat down at the kitchen table and she made tea without asking and sat across from me. "How was it?" she said. "Interesting," I said. She looked at me over her mug. After 31 years of marriage, she could read an entire conversation in a single word. "What did she do?" she said. I told her. Not with bitterness, I want to be clear about that. I told her the way you tell someone about something that happened, a thing that revealed something you hadn't quite seen clearly before. Claire listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "She doesn't know you," Claire said finally. "No," I said. "I don't think she does." "That's not entirely her fault," Claire said, which surprised me. "You never let her." I sat with that. Claire has a way of saying the thing you didn't want to hear in a tone that makes it impossible to be angry at. She was right, of course. I had kept my professional life so separate, so sealed away, that the people around me had been forced to fill in the gaps themselves. And in the absence of information, people fill gaps with whatever narrative is most available. To Renee, who had grown up watching me fix leaking taps and rehang screen doors and spend weekends in my workshop, the narrative that made sense was the one she'd told. A useful, unremarkable man who worked with his hands and didn't amount to much. I had built that story by refusing to correct it. The question I had to sit with, in the weeks that followed, was whether I was angry at Renee for believing the story or at myself for writing it. She called 3 days later. Not to apologize, exactly. Renee was not a person who apologized with ease, which was something else her father had left her. She called to talk, which, for her, was its own kind of reaching. "I didn't know," she said. "I genuinely didn't know what you'd built." "I know," I said. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I thought about it. "Because I wanted you to respect me for showing up," I said, "not for what I'd accomplished." She was quiet on the other end for a moment. "I should have shown more respect either way," she said. It wasn't a full apology, but it was honest, and I have always valued honesty over performance. We talked for 40 minutes. About her childhood, about her father, about what it had been like to have a stepfather arrive when she was already half-formed, already carrying so much. She said things she had probably never said to Claire, and I listened the way I had learned to listen over years of running a company without rushing to respond, without filling every silence. Before she hung up, she said, "Garrison's mother really likes you." "I like her too," I said. "She has good instincts." Renee laughed, a real one, not a performed one. The kind I had heard maybe a dozen times in 20 years. I hung up and sat in my workshop for a while, running my hand along a piece of oak I'd been shaping into a small cabinet. The wood was smooth where I'd worked it and rough where I hadn't yet. I thought about how things get made, how it takes a long time, how most of the work is invisible, how the finished piece looks effortless even though you know exactly how many hours are inside it. I thought about how that is also, in many ways, a description of a life. There is something I have come to believe after 63 years of building things, and I will say it plainly. The value of a person is not located in their title or their income or what they are introduced as at a dinner. It is located in the consistency of their character across time, in whether they show up, whether they repair what is broken, whether they do good work and do it quietly, and do it for the right reasons. These things accumulate over decades in ways that cannot be faked and cannot be hurried. They become structural. They hold the weight of other people's lives without ever asking for credit. I have known men with considerable wealth who were poor in every way that mattered. I have known tradesmen who understood dignity and honor more deeply than anyone in a boardroom I ever sat in. The mistake that young people make, and it is a forgivable mistake, because it comes from inexperience, not malice, is assuming that the surface of a thing tells you everything about its depth. It doesn't. A handyman and a man who built a company and a stepfather, who drove 4 hours round trip to be in a waiting room, these were all the same person. They were all me. None of them was less true than the others. What I hope Renee takes from that evening is not embarrassment. I don't want her to carry shame about what she said. I want her to carry the lesson, which is simply this. The person in front of you is almost always more than the label you've given them. Most people are carrying a larger life than their introduction suggests. Treat them accordingly. Not because it's strategic, not because they might turn out to be important, but because it is the right way to treat a human being who has lived and worked and tried, and who showed up to your dinner in a jacket with a torn pocket because that's the jacket they wear. Garrison is a good man. I could see it in how he treated the server, how he listened when others spoke, how he looked at Renee not with ownership but with care. That tells you more about a person than their family's address or their father's business. Renee chose well, even if she doesn't fully know it yet. Claire put it simply. Later, when we were gardening on a Saturday in early December, the last mild weekend before the ground froze. She'll grow into it, she said, meaning Renee, meaning all of it. People mostly do, if you give them time. I pressed a bulb into the soil and covered it over. I know, I said. I'm in no hurry. The garden doesn't ask to be acknowledged. It just grows. And in the spring, when everything comes up, the tulips, the garlic, the stubborn perennials that have survived a dozen winters, you don't stand back and demand that people admire it. You just let them see it. That's enough.